All right, so we're going to start out as we normally do with our blessing for learning, which is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with commandments and commands us regarding engaging in words and matters of instruction of Torah. And today we are returning to our monthly topic of Zionism, particularly liberal Zionism as presented in Rabbi Stanley David's amazing work called The Fragile Dialogue. So here's the cover, the title page of that book. And so Rabbi Davids and Rabbi Englander are the editors, and we read Rabbi David's piece on liberal Zionism last month. And now we're moving on to the second piece, which is more specific about Zionism and Reform Judaism. It's by Rabbi Michael Marmur, who is a professor at HUCJIR and a scholar of some note. And he is taking on some topics that are probably near and dear to some of our hearts in these interesting and challenging times. So we're going to jump in a little bit, and please don't hesitate to stop and ask me questions and interrupt me and offer comments, because that's what we're here for. So, myths and facts, Zionism and Reform Judaism. Some decades ago, Israeli embassies around the world used to distribute a pamphlet entitled Myths and Facts. It set out all a young Israel activist needed to know in 2 columns, somewhat like the blessings and curses ranged against each other on 2 mountains described in the book of Deuteronomy. On one side of the page were the myths, libelous calumnies perpetrated and disseminated by Israel's enemies, and the facts of the case were presented on the other side of the page. Here we were reminded that Israel is a peace-seeking beacon of democracy surrounded by bellicose adversaries. The booklet allowed no space for ambivalence or complexity. Rather, the power of facts was prescribed as an antidote to the poison of myth. So I don't know if many of you remember this particular thing, but Myths and Facts was a big project of what Israelis call haspara. Haspara is the Hebrew word for explanation. And merely the idea of it is, in fact, part of the challenge of the Israeli undertaking here. That is, Israelis don't understand why all Jews in the world don't speak Hebrew. And therefore, they create a mandate for explaining to the world what Israel is about. And the program is called Explanation, but it's called Explanation in Hebrew. And so one has to be an insider to understand what they're talking about to begin with. And the Myths and Facts was a product of that early effort. And Myths and Facts, there was a Myths and Facts book. There were pamphlets. It was a big deal. And one could say, especially if we look at the outcome of it, that it was pretty much a total failure. As a lot of Israeli attempts to make the Israeli case to the world have been, in large part because of what I think Rabbi Marmur is going to talk about. But we'll see. Any questions or comments? Okay. As the years have passed, Rabbi Marmur continues, my views about the meanings of myths and facts have changed. A myth is not a lie. It is usually a story, a way of marshaling experiences and memories and attitudes. Myths are not the opposite of facts, but rather the way in which we prioritize and deploy them. In order to serve a communal or personal need, to explain a mystery, or to bridge a gulf between what seems to be happening and what I believe must be the truth. It would be nice to believe that people who believe what I believe walk by the clear light of the truth, while those who believe something different are condemned to stumble around in the gloom. This is not my understanding of the way things actually are in the world. And I think this is a very important aspect. The idea that a myth in and of itself is to some extent an organizing principle. We use a myth as the storyline to organize the facts by which we present to make our case. So the myth becomes this narrative argument. For example, one important myth about Israel that we use to organize our information that we have changed over the last 25 years is the idea that no Arabs were expelled from Israel during the War of Independence. This was a foundational myth in the War of Independence that Arabs just left of their own devices. And this is not what actually happened. What actually happened is far more complicated and bloody in some cases. And there were terrible things that happened in 1940, 48 and 49. And that doesn't make Israel's cause any less just, knowing the complexity of it. Rather, it makes justice more difficult to pursue because there are justifiable complaints on the multiple sides. So if that makes any sense. Rabbi Marmur continues, I do not espouse a point of view according to which everything is simply a question of your point of view. We live in a period of history in which big lies have been disseminated with genocidal consequences. Lies should be exposed and resisted. But for every lie out there in the world, every gruesome fabrication designed to deceive, there are 100 quote unquote facts, presentations of reality that have been squeezed into a myth in order to make sense of the world. And I think, interestingly enough, we live in a world perhaps even more determined by this now. That sounds like the opposite of truth, says Banjo Bob. Bob, so here's the big question. Truth is complicated. So, for example, let's stick with Zionism. Zionism is the, from my definition, the movement for self-determination of the Jewish people in the homeland that we have identified historically as Jewish. However, Zionism, from the perspective of a Palestinian living in a refugee camp, is an imperial colonial movement to rid them of their home. Those are both true from a certain perspective. Neither is the complete truth. And so Zionism has, in effect, spawned a lot of people having to leave their homes. It was done to make sure that some people could return to their homes when they had no other homes. It doesn't simplify the complexity of somebody left their home and somebody else is now living in it, and the arguments that we use to justify why that happened. And I can say that, okay, there are millions upon millions of Arabs and dozens of Arab countries, and why can't the Arabs take in the Palestinians like Jews took in, the Israeli Jews took in the Jews of Iran and Iraq and Syria and Egypt and Morocco, where all those Jews left and fled in Syria after 1948. Why couldn't we have just done an exchange? Except that doesn't feel fair to anyone. That's two unfairnesses, right? The unfairness of a Palestinian having to leave their home and the unfairness of a Jew having to leave their home. And it's not solved by saying who suffered worse. And
well, that's like Solomon's supposed suggested solution to the two mothers.
Right, split the baby in half. So this is a complicated problem. You know, a simple problem on the one hand, who gets to live where? A complicated problem because then on top of who's in whose home, it's who gets to vote about who lives in whose home. So, for example, one of the big issues facing Israel is the occupation of the West Bank. So why are Judea and Samaria, as some Israelis call them, or the West Bank, why is it occupied, and why are the Palestinians there not given full rights as Israeli citizens? The answer is simple demographics. Israel is committed to being a democratic state. Israel is committed to being a Jewish state. The only way to keep Israel Jewish and democratic is to make sure that the majority of people living in Israel are Jewish. If the Palestinians living in the West Bank were given the right to vote, the Jewish majority of Israel would be done for. This is a fundamental demographic population problem. And which is why we came up with a multi-state solution. However, it turns out that's not so easy to negotiate either. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. All right. Is it a myth or a fact that Israelis and Palestinians are prepared to negotiate a two-state solution? Those in favor of such a solution point out that despite terrible circumstances, surveys suggest that a majority of people on both sides still express this preference. Those dead set against this eventuality insist that such surveys are part of an attempt to encourage appeasement and eventual destruction. Simply considering the facts of the case will not settle the debate, because it all depends on how you prioritize and consider those facts. On both sides of this debate, we are acutely aware of the myths perpetrated by the other, and usually we are oblivious to our own myths. The facts we consider to be incontrovertible live within the myths, the narrative frameworks. Is the story of the binding of Isaac the tale of a delusional father on the verge of homicide, or that of a hero of monotheism ultimately oriented to the ethical? So the two-state solution, or what we might now have to consider a multi-state solution, because whether or not Gaza and the West Bank could ever actually be a single state is a whole nother conundrum, is a perfect example of this, which is that among Israelis, there is a significant divide about whether or not a two-state solution is a good idea. Among Palestinians, there is a significant divide. And once we get into the weeds of this argument, it gets very complicated because, as Rabbi Marmur points out, my facts are often your myths if we're arguing. So the things I accept as incontrovertible, as he says, are justified by a whole series of stuff which you may in fact argue with. Yeah, Michael.
I would like to suggest, maybe for the sake of argument, that a good part of the problem with people accepting a two-state solution goes all the way back to the original partition, and that was so ridiculously impossible that it gives the opponents a very strong, emotionally strong argument to oppose any two-state solution.
So I would say, Michael, it's even more complicated than that. That is to say that the original partition, the 1947 plan, partition plan, as put forward by the UN, and we are approaching the, if you can believe it, 73rd anniversary of that agreement on November 29th. Kaftet November was when the UN declared the partition plan, the 29th of November. That partition plan, as you pointed out, was an impossible thing. right? So it was the two states created were impractical at best.
It was a checkerboard.
Right. However, improbable as it was, Israel survived with its 1948-49 borders after the War of Independence, which was also pretty improbable, all the way through 1967 when its borders were increased significantly. However, I would say that the resistance to the two-state solution is layered under so many other guises. Remembering that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded in 1963, prior to the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967. So they wanted the original plan, Palestine, that the PLO wanted to liberate, was the Palestine under the original partition plan and the 1948-49 borders, not the Palestinians occupied after 1967. So the PLO has never been about a compromise. It was always about get the Jews out, because the PLO was part of the pan-Arab movements of the 1950s and 60s, started by President Nasser in Egypt. So those pan-Arab movements, an Arab liberation movement, throwing off colonialism, identified Israel as a colonial power from the get-go. That complicates it considerably. Then we have Palestinian refugees from 1948-49, and then Palestinian refugees from 1967. And in that, we have conflict in the Arab world as well, because the Arab world doesn't like, most of the Arab countries didn't want the Palestinians resettling in them to begin with. They don't like the Palestinians. Arabs are not a monolithic people. The Lebanese are different from the Syrians, and the Syrians are subdivided into multiple ethnicities. The Jordanians are their own ethnicity, with some Palestinians already thrown in. The Jordanians and the Saudis don't like each other. They're relatives who split over a kingdom. Egyptians live on another continent and are totally different people to begin with. So all the neighbors of Israel are in fact not homogeneously the same people, nor do they necessarily get along with the Arab peoples, the Palestinians who lived in the area that is Israel. All of that is complicated by the fact that starting in 1967, Israelis split over what to do with the territories as well. And that Israelis have a religious Zionist bent that says all of the land as determined by biblical borders, which includes much of Jordan and Syria, is Israel, which clearly is not going to happen. And so I wish there were only one source for the complexity about the attitudes towards the two-state solution. But yeah, it's the history only gets more complicated. And of course, what's really amazing about it is, considering how few people are involved in it, it's amazing how complicated it gets. Rather than see everything in terms of an epic battle between truth and falsehood, we might do better to become more aware of the different stories we tell each other, myths into which we pour our facts. To believe that my myth is the only true one on the market is improbable and arrogant. I reject the possibility that everyone who puts the world together differently than I do is a rogue or a fool. Truth may be rare. Our rabbinic tradition points out that the Hebrew word for truth is made up of letters of the alphabet as far away from each other as possible. But I strongly believe that there is more than one myth capable of expressing it. This makes me a pluralist. And this is particularly Reform Jews, right? Reform Jews are strong advocates of pluralism. That is the idea that there is way more than one truth out there. That your truth and my truth are both reflections of an essential truth, but neither is necessarily more important than the other. They are both important. All of them are important. The multiplicity is important. When myths clash, the result can be volatile. The state of Israel provides a classic example. Is 1948 the flowering of redemption or the great disaster? The flowering of redemption is, of course, what Jews call it. The great disaster, the Nakba in Arabic, is what Arabs call the War of Independence in 1948. Is 1967 about reunification or occupation? Reunification of Jerusalem or occupation of all of the territories? Is Israel a symbol of repression of national rights or protection of national rights? In recent years, the gulf between the different versions of the facts seems to be growing still wider, as can be witnessed on university campuses around the world. Which version of what is taking place in Israel or Palestine do you accept? Is the TB version, Ahmed TB is a Palestinian member of Israel's Knesset, or the Bibi version, named for Prime Minister Netanyahu? Is your prism that of BA, B'nai Akiva, an Orthodox Zionist youth movement, or of the BBC, or of BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement? In other words, as we have seen in this country, the people we get our information from help shape the narrative that we talk about. And the people who are our allies are the ones who provide the filter through which we interpret our facts. While it has not been as bitter or as violent as that clash of narratives, the discourse between Reform Judaism and Zionism can be understood as a case of competing myths. Both movements rose to prominence in the 19th century, each striving to offer a response to the dizzying challenges of modernity. From that start, each tended to regard the other with a degree of suspicion and a marked lack of sympathy. For many classical reformers, the idea of a rampant nationalism seemed the very antithesis of their most cherished values. In the Zionist camp, meanwhile, reform was often portrayed as tepid assimilationism incapable of engendering deep Jewish commitment. So this is a very important distinction. Reform Judaism starts in the 18 teens as an evolution of the Enlightenment movement in Germany and Central Europe. The first Reform Jews are attempting to really express Judaism as a form of higher thought, a form of philosophy, a form of ethics, and a form of higher religious worship. And they are devoted to being citizens in the countries that they are and Jews. So Germans and Jews, eventually Americans and Jews, that both become important parts of Reformed Jewish identity. Zionists are focused on the culture of Judaism, the rebirth of Judaism as a movement that could actually rule a country. And so they are focused on agriculture and dance and language and things that set us apart from the people among whom we live. And so we can see this idea that Zionists are embracing nationalism. And nationalism for 19th century Jews is viewed as the evil that spawns wars throughout Europe. So we have a lot of battle lines drawn among early Zionists and early reformers about the other being the Jews that we are not. In 1916, an article appeared in the American Jewish Chronicle. Its author, David Newmark, was a member of the faculty of the Hebrew Union College, having been brought to the faculty as an expert in Jewish philosophy. Before coming to America, he was born in Galicia, and had been living in Germany. Newmark had been involved both in the Reform movement and in the movement for Hebrew national revival. As part of these activities, he had become acquainted with Asher Ginsburg, who is known by his pen name Echad Ha'am, the leader of what was often known as cultural Zionism. So, as you can see, Echad Ha'am was Asher Ginsburg. Asher Ginsburg, another Eastern European name, but he took on one of the people was his Hebrew pen name, and he is very much sort of the voice of cultural Zionism in the early 20th century. In his 1916 article, Newmark attempted to resolve and harmonize the apparent conflict between Zionism and Reform Judaism. His proposed solution was startling. In fact, all modern Zionists, except perhaps a very few who may not be religious at all, are good Reform Jews. And this is one of the things that's very interesting, is that Zionism is not, strictly religious. And therefore, if we look at early Zionist religious practices, they seem a lot more like Reform Jews than not. They certainly seem more in line with Reform Jewish thinking. It is perhaps not surprising that Newmark's essay was met by a stern rejoinder from Echad Ha'am himself, who used a very similar form of logic to reach the opposite conclusion. Anyone inspecting the theological claims of the Reform movement, he argued, would soon appreciate how flimsy and unconvincing they were. So there must be another reason to explain the commitment of these well-meaning, if misguided Jews to the product of Jewish life. He proposed that the reformers were in fact Jewish nationalists, however much some of them attempted to deny the fact. So here we have the Reform Jewish Authority saying all Zionists are really Reform Jews, and the Zionist Cultural Authority saying all Reform Jews are actually Jewish nationalists, are actually Zionists. That you just need to admit that you're one of us. And one of the ways in which Echad Ha'am made this claim, I imagine, is by virtue of the fact that Reform Jews had focused on what we call ethical monotheism. That is, that Judaism demanded good behavior more than a system of obligation to mitzvot, to commandments and rituals. And good behavior is something that is, of course, demanded by Jewish nationalists. So the Reformed Jewish theology, in his mind, just, makes Reformed Jews into natural nationalists, which is a very interesting idea. A century ago, these Reformed Jews and Zionists were attempting to squeeze the other's facts into their own myths. You're really Reform and you just haven't realized it. You are a Zionist after all. This is hardly an example of a meaningful discourse. It is instead a kind of name calling. Rather than insult the other, we accuse them of being something they did not wish to be. You may think you are someone, we say to the other, but in fact you are just like me. You just never knew it. As all of you probably understand, this is not an effective form of convincing people of anything. Telling people that the way they think is just like the way I think is no way for me to convince anyone that of the way I think at all. It's a way for me to insult people, not convince people. I am a Reform Jew who has chosen to make his life in Israel. As such, I am the product of two heady myths. Reform Judaism is predicated on the notion that modernity is a fact of life and that we Jews have to come up with a way of responding to it. We believe that if we hold up the finest of our Jewish tradition to the light of modernity, we will be able to examine further and refine a Judaism robust and relevant enough to be passed on to our children. At the heart of Reform Judaism is this notion that we are part of the modern world and our Judaism should be as well, and that Judaism will thrive when it is modernized. Roughly. I live in Israel, a land of potent myths. Here, so the story goes, millennia of wandering have come to an end, and Hebrew culture can be embodied and enacted. Here, the Jews can live as an Am Olam, a particular people with a strong universal orientation. Here, the values of humanity and compassion can live alongside a vigorous nationalism. This, at least, was the vision on offer in Exodus, the Hollywood movie, rather than the book of the Bible, gleaming in Paul Newman's bright blue eyes. In recent years, the myths of classical reform and classical Zionism have been in decline. It is painful and uncomfortable to face up to this. And perhaps for that reason, we sometimes greet examples of hatred from our opponents with something like relief. When someone crazy does something crazy to a worshiper at the Western Wall, when a university campus seethes with vitriol, when we encounter some old-fashioned anti-Semitism, when a nuclear neighbor calls for our destruction, in these and other cases, we are excused from having to think in a nuanced way about our own narrative. This is very important because when we are in crisis, when we are in existential crisis, threatened from outside, we get to not worry about who we are as much. We get to focus on the existential crisis. because it's much more important. So when Israel is threatened from outside, Israel's questions about its own identity and Zionism fall to the wayside, because who has time to think about such questions when we're fighting for our lives? When we face anti-Semitism run amok here in the United States, we don't have to think about the nature of our Jewish identity. We are Jews in opposition, in defiance of a world that seems to hate us. So that how we are Jewish is far less important at such times. Rabbi Marmur continues, the dictates of survival surpass the imperative of self-examination, which is what I just said. But such self-examination is in fact crucial. It is difficult to avoid two extreme aspects of ideological discourse. One is arm wrestling, as exemplified by the 1916 correspondence noted above. We show that our approach is in fact the dominant one, and even if we appease our adversaries, we are in fact attempting to defeat them. Another extreme response is breastbeating. We become hyper-aware of the shortcomings and hypocrisies of our own side and reject previously held beliefs with the zeal of the convert. So, right, the initial dialogue here, you're not really a Reform Jew, or your Reform Judaism is just Zionism, or your Zionism is just Reform Judaism. I'm going to browbeat you or arm wrestle you, as opposed to breastbeating, which is I'm going to tout all of my good beliefs as a way of overcoming all the flaws in my argument. In other words, I'm going to speak loudly about my good stuff, and you're going to ignore my bad stuff. Needless to say, these are not dialogic tools. These are yelling at each other tools. There is a third way, however difficult it is to find, that runs between arm wrestling and breastbeating. It might be called soul searching. It calls us to take a look at our own declarations and see how they hold up in reality. Here are just a couple of examples. Many Reform Jews still adhere to the notion of informed choice, according to which each autonomous individual attains a level of education on ritual and other matters and can make decisions on their own practice based on this erudition. In my view, an honest appraisal of this approach will compel us to look for an alternative currency for decision-making and commitment. Okay, so this is very interesting, because what he's going to attack here, I think, is individualism versus communitarianism, which is at the heart of some of our Jewish questions. To maintain that what we should do, that what we in fact do, is send every possible mitzvah to the laboratory for forensic examination before deciding whether it is to be adopted, is fanciful. For some, this means abandoning the project of non-Orthodox Judaism. For others, such as me, this heralds its next chapter. In my example of the mitzvah laboratory, we should look to our communities as arenas for growth and experimentation based on our commitment to each other and the dynamism of Jewish tradition. Perhaps the next iteration of informed choice would involve communities, synagogues, or small groups of individuals agreeing to take on certain activities for a year, experiencing and learning together, and then discussing the long-term resonance and applicability of these mitzvot in the lives of each individual. So, what he's saying here is very important. In Reform Judaism, individual choice has been a rallying cry. We let people choose their own way. However, we still need a community standard, right? So if everybody showed up to Temple Beth Zion or Temple Beth El or any other Reform synagogue and said, okay, I'm just going to pray the way I want to, we don't have a community prayer service. We have a bunch of people praying in their own way. So we have to come to some consensus. Furthermore, we have to come to some consensus about some very basic ritual things. How is our kitchen going to be kosher as a community? Is it okay for somebody to bring in their ham sandwich and eat it as part of our own egg? We don't tell anybody that they can't eat ham, but we might be able to tell people that ham is not welcome in the synagogue. And those are not inconsistent, but we can't be only about individual choice. So if we're going to give everybody the tools to experiment with Jewish practice, then what Rabbi Marmur is proposing here is this idea that we would do informed choice as a community. We would take on a certain type of ritual practice, do it for a year, and then decide how we want to do it going forward. It's not a bad idea. It requires a lot of effort. It is, in fact, pretty much the way Reconstructionists tend to do things. Anyway, moving on. Tens of thousands of Israeli youngsters travel to Poland each year, where a certain version of the Jewish experience is presented to them. Wrapped in the Israeli flag, our children walk through the death camps, often accompanied by their diaspora contemporaries, and are expected to return home motivated to defend the motherland. We have to find another story to tell our children, one that does not root a philosophy of life in a collective memory of death. I want to just emphasize this. There is a tradition in Israel of taking young people to Poland, to Germany, on a tour of the death camps as a way of rallying them with the March of the Living people from the United States for joining in their lifelong defense of the land of Israel. And Rabbi Marmur is making a very good point here, which is that if one wants to get young Israelis enthusiastic about joining the Israeli Defense Forces and defending Israel, one might need a more updated narrative than the European Holocaust from the 1940s. That there might be a better way of motivating and bringing those students together in the kind of cohesion that you'd want for them joining the Israeli military.
Can I say something, Rabbi?
Of course, Linda.
Okay. So my daughter did that. She did the March of the Living. And she came back so depressed. And I have to tell you that it really affected her, at this point, non anything. And whereas I thought as a parent, a responsible parent, I was sending her to connect to her Judaism, it was the opposite. So I certainly can connect with what you just said.
So, and it's not an either or, right, Linda? It's a both and, right? The March of the Living, Rachel Barrett remarks here that the JCC in Krakow has a ride for the living at the end of June every year, and she plans on going. There is nothing inherently wrong with March of the Living and seeing where we come from. What Rabbi Marmur is pointing out here is it shouldn't be the only supporting plank in our Jewish identity. And I think what you're talking about, Linda, is if we substitute Holocaust remembrance and memorializing for Jewish identity, it's not enough. We need more than that. So, for example, I think March of the Living is, as a first-time experience, is a challenge if it's not also paired with a trip to Israel. So that
no, she did go to Israel too.
Yeah.
But you know what, I think she's going to come around. The problem was she wasn't able to verbalize it when she came back, and it was anyhow. All right, that's enough. Thank you.
It's hugely depressing, for sure.
Thank you.
There's no way around it.
Okay.
In Israel, we rehearse our founding myths regularly, and they form part of the civil religion of the state. To proceed to Israel's next stage of maturity, it is necessary to acknowledge the dreams and narratives of our Palestinian neighbors and fellow citizens. What to do with all these conflicting myths? So many facts and truths all shouted out simultaneously. What we mark as Independence Day is seen by Palestinians as the day of disaster, Nakba. Some in Israeli government circles have proposed that any mention of this competing Nakba narrative be suppressed. A law passed in 2011 gives the finance minister the right to withhold funds to organizations that refuse to see independence as a cause for unalloyed rejoicing. I believe that the strategy of denial is doomed. We will need to find ways of acknowledging that our neighbors' myths are as real as our own, even if they seem to be at odds with each other. And we see that in the United States.
You know what that means?
Right? We have Columbus Day being transformed into Indigenous American Day. And the history of Columbus Day is pretty interesting. There is a very worthwhile podcast by the guy who wrote Outliers, whose name slips my mind. I'll get it for you in a moment.
Malcolm Gladwell.
That's it, Malcolm Gladwell, Revisionist History. I'll put the link in the chat before we leave. And he evaluates the difference between American chutzpah and Israeli chutzpah. And one of his definitions of so American chutzpah, he identifies with the creation of Hogan's Heroes. Hogan's Heroes is a comedy set in a concentration camp with Nazis as main characters, written and performed by Jews, some of whom are in fact Holocaust survivors, and produced by Jews. And he identifies that as sort of American Jewish chutzpah, the taking on of something that would be preposterous otherwise. Israeli chutzpah is a negative trait. Chutzpah is not the being bold, because everybody in Israeli is bold, like Americans call chutzpah. Chutzpah in Israeli Hebrew is defiance of norms with such brashness as to be totally irrational. And his case in point is actually Columbus Day. Because the Columbus Day parade in New York City was founded by the mafia to rehabilitate the image of not Italian Americans, but mafia Italian Americans. Because in the 60s, the head of the mafia, one of the big dons, was actually a celebrity who went on Johnny Carson and all sorts of things. And the story is quite interesting. I think we need Italian American days as much as we need Irish American days, like St. Patrick's Day, as much as we need Jewish American days and Indigenous American days and African American days like Juneteenth. We need to be able to celebrate who we are. However, the Columbus Day story is quite ironic and interesting. So I'll find that link for you and put it in the chat before we're done today. But in any event, denial, this aspect of Israeli culture, which is there are some things that are allowed to be talked about and there are some things that are not, is, I think, incredibly detrimental, because it's detrimental to what we call liberal democracy, with a lowercase l and a lowercase d, which is that in a liberal democracy, everybody has the right to talk about the things that we talk about, that we have free expression. And Israelis have a tendency, an interesting tendency, to actually want to stymie free expression of people with whom they disagree. And it's not a terribly positive trait, in my mind. Any questions before we move on? No questions. You guys are very quiet today. Okay. Each of us should be encouraged to confront the problematic elements of our own myths and to be attentive to the power of the myths of the other. Those of us enamored of the views currently dominating Israeli politics should ask ourselves if, in fact, we have no potential partner for negotiation, if, in fact, our army is the most ethical in the world, if there are, in fact, palatable alternatives to a two-state solution, and where settlement activity is actually leading. Left-leaning Zionists should ask themselves if the current state of the Middle East allows for the kind of peace process they dream of, if the idea that we can be both a military and an ethical superpower has any grounding in reality. And they might also wonder why the solutions they offer are not currently favored by the majority of Israeli citizens. So this is a huge amount of soul searching on the part of Israelis, which is not currently happening. That is to say that we don't question, we often, most of us don't question our basic assumptions. So each of these assumptions you have probably heard before as axioms, right? As concrete facts. The right wing in Israel says there is no real partner for negotiations all the time. And there's plenty of arguments to support that. There are also plenty of arguments to say, well, it's complicated. And if we were to participate in figuring out how to build a partner, we might have a partner. Is the Israeli army the most ethical in the world? Well, whenever we say we're the best, we genuinely, that's genuinely, generally speaking, an opportunity for self-examination. If there are, in fact, palatable alternatives to a two-state solution, what could a non-two-state solution look like? Is there a three-state solution? Is there a way of coming to some accommodation to create a different type of citizenship for West Bank Palestinians? I don't know, but we have certainly locked ourselves into the idea that there is only one unpalatable solution to things, where settlement activity is actually leading. So what is the point of settlement activity in Israel? Anybody know?
Is it security, Rabbi?
Well, so that's certainly one of the ideas, that Arabs in something like an Indian reservation in the United States. An interesting idea, Rachel. Not anything that anybody who's ever been to an Indian reservation would identify as a good idea necessarily, since it's not necessarily been a good equal solution for Native Americans. But certainly the idea of security has been a major idea for settlements, that the settlements were meant to create a more secure place for all of Israel by creating a buffer zone, right? So that you would have buffer between what was the pre-1967 borders of Israel and whatever arrangement would happen with the Palestinians. However, the problem with that is that's not the way it's come about. What we have ended up with is a Swiss cheese taking over of the West Bank, with Israeli settlements not merely gathered in easy areas around the main population centers of Israel, but actually dotted throughout the West Bank with the express intent of making it impossible for the West Bank ever to become it would never become a whole independent second state, because to extract the Israeli settlements from it has created quote unquote facts on the ground that make it impossible for the two-state solution to be pursued. So that's one of the challenges on the right, is that really what is going on in that particular area is an attempt to undermine there ever being a two-state solution. On the left, however, right, left-leaning Zionists have to ask themselves if the current state of the Middle East peace allows for the kind of peace process they dream of. is the Middle East going to allow a Palestinian-Israeli resolution? Interestingly enough, we could point to one of the accomplishments of the Trump administration as maybe making that possible, that the peace with the United Arab Emirates and the other Arab countries that has happened in the last couple of months might be the beginning of an internationally brokered peace deal that might lead to Palestinian-Israeli peace. But I think, interestingly enough, it's easier to make peace with other countries than to make peace with the Palestinians who are not quite up their own country yet.
I think that one of the supporting arguments that is used by people who support Trump's actions as being good is that this just goes to prove none of the Arabs want them either.
Well, yeah. So,
which is there may be a kernel of truth in that, but I have known a couple of Palestinian Arabs living in Buffalo, and I know there's a tendency I believe there's a tendency in Arab culture to agree with people that you're talking to, whether you really agree or not, just to keep the peace. And none of them seem very happy with the schism between Israelis and Arabs. One of them was from a Jordanian family from Jerusalem, and they loved the king, the prior king, but they said, they kind of said the same kind of thing I've ever said, that if the Israelis and the Arabs could live peacefully, they both end up more prosperous.
Well, the old saying about Israelis and Palestinians is they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Yeah.
Ruth, what did you want to say?
Unmute.
Go ahead, Ruth.
Oh, okay. I have a friend who lives in Ohio who talks on a regular basis with her friend who has relocated back to Israel. And when Donald Trump met with those at that meeting and did what he did, the Palestinians, her friend in Israel was telling her how the Palestinians were having riots going on. And of course, excuse me, we see a lot, through TV and the media, and what we see on it, it's not always necessarily true. But what was happening in Israel was that the Palestinians were very unhappy about it. And it wasn't being reported, but they were having quite a number of riots going on there. And when you talk about the Palestinians, I remember when I was a teenager back in the 60s, my late father, who was very pro-Israel, we had a discussion about the Palestinians, and he said, at the time, I said about, the other Arab countries helping them. And he says the other Arab countries don't even want them. And apparently it seems like they just use them. And, it's sad, in a way. I mean, that they just use them to attack Israel instead of helping them build them up into, into a positive experience.
Well, unfortunately, your friend is correct. Historically, Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Gaza have been pawns in the conflict between Israelis and Arabs. During the 1950s, when Egypt ruled the Gaza Strip, Egypt kept Gaza poor and used Gaza as a recruitment place for suicide bombers into Israel, and for attacking Israel with Gazans. Historically, while yes, many Palestinians did resettle in Jordan, the Jordanians ruled the West Bank from 1948 until 1967 and maintained the refugee camps there and did not break them up, did not help the Palestinians resettle, did not create infrastructure there in the 19 years that Jordan ruled the West Bank. So it is a problematic relationship. Same with Lebanon and the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and same to a certain extent with Syria. And so it is as a definitely complicated relationship. Rabbi Marmur goes on, Reform Jews have some soul searching to do as well. I have mentioned the axiom of informed choice, and there are others that also bear serious examination. We offer our adherents of Judaism, a Judaism of meaning, moments of transcendence and affirmation, but it is not clear that the worldview underpinning this approach can provide what anthropologists call thick experience. When summer camp is over and everyday life resumes, is our Judaism engaging and fulfilling enough? And this is a constant struggle. Are we, in fact, as liberal Jews, providing a Judaism that is literally thick enough, meaty enough to provide daily meaning and reflection and connection for Jews? Classical secular Zionism and Reform Judaism have much in common, and an honest encounter between the two may yield important and creative results. Zionism's emphasis on Jewish peoplehood can influence and yet also be tempered by Reform's awareness of the dangers of chauvinism. Reform's openness to the spiritual and ritual domains can influence and yet also be tempered by Zionism's engagement with the gritty realities of building a functioning society. We need each other's myths to enrich our own. I can say with great enthusiasm that this is now happening through the reform education of Israeli Reform rabbis. That currently in Israel, Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion has a Jerusalem campus at which not only do American rabbinical, international rabbinical students go there for their first year to study, but now well over 100 rabbis have been ordained who are Israeli born or Israeli rabbis who do their entirety of their rabbinic education in Israel to serve Reform Jews in Israel who are Israelis, not Americans or Europeans or South Americans. And this is a major shift, that we actually have a living Israeli movement for progressive Judaism with its own rabbinic and cantorial talents, who are mixing Zionism and an Israeli Reform Judaism, not an American Reform Judaism, but an Israeli Reform Judaism. And
I don't have to worry about how much of the service is in English.
They don't worry about how much of the service is in English, that's for sure. It's all in Hebrew. So the biblical Jacob, so the book of Genesis recounts, struggled with a mysterious being at the ford of Jabbok. And after this encounter, he received an extra name, Israel. Many explanations have been offered for the identity of Jacob's nocturnal adversary. I want to suggest that his struggle that night and our challenge every day is with our myths. They are powerful, after all. They give us the energy we need to continue. But part of our narrative is that they have to be faced. Zionists, Reform Jews, and others too, we have to be prepared to dismantle our grand stories if our grand story is to continue. We have to confront our myths and our facts in order to continue to become Israel. And it just so happens that we're coming up in a couple of weeks on this story in Genesis. So as we study together, this week is the story of Isaac and Toldot, but a week after that is Vayetze, the story where Jacob goes out, and then the story after that is Vayishlach, where he re-encounters Esau. So we have Jacob's story coming up. And Jacob's story is our story, a struggle with the divine, a struggle with our mythos, our struggle with our individual ideas of truth. And we will never get to a communal truth that is transformative for the world if we don't first take on our own.
You've pointed out another myth in Judaism that doesn't seem to get recognized all that much. The myth that Orthodox Jews in the modern sense, in the current sense, are the original Jews. That modern and I don't mean modern Orthodox. I mean Orthodoxy as it's seen today by the Haredi, for example, that they are the only true inheritors of what is actually classical Judaism.
So one of the challenges that we face as Jews of all types is a recognition that all of us are modern. And that even, I would point out that even the Amish are modern, because the Amish, in rejecting progress, have in fact taken on a modern stance. And Orthodoxy is a modern movement in that it is a rejection of progress, of change and assimilation. And you have to have progress, change, and assimilation to have a reaction against it. So the reactionary nature of Orthodoxy separates it from what we would call traditional or historical Judaism, something which Michael has heard me point out numerous times. But it is in fact a central myth perpetrated upon us for the sake of making us feel bad for not being more Orthodox. But I don't think we need to feel bad.
By the way, you could also, the flip side of that is, since you brought up the Amish, is, from what I understand at least, you could take the mapping of Judaism, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and like that, and map the same kind of thing onto the Amish community, because some of them are a lot more liberal than others.
Well, no group of people is monolithic. We only appear to be homogeneous from the outside. And we are all diverse. And Reform Judaism's greatest strength is its adherence to pluralism, to the idea that each of us comes with a value set that is worth hearing from, with a truth set that is worth acknowledging, and a myth set that is worth understanding, so that through our meeting, we encounter one another as images of mystery and the divine, and thus come to something better together, which I hope all of us manage in this season of challenge and difficulty, in this season of hopefully giving thanks, and in this season of, God willing, may it be a coming together to triumph over adversity. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And I put the podcast on chutzpah versus chutzpah in the chat, so you can click on that, or you can just search, with Ruth's help, Malcolm Gladwell, Revisionist History, and chutzpah, and you'll find it wherever you get podcasts. I hope everybody has a good rest of your week and a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Bye.
you all.